My name is Alexandra Hudkowski. I'm the curator of public programs here at the museum. And this afternoon kicks off the first programs and the first day of Making Home Smithsonian Design Triennial. We just had an amazing conversation and introduction from the curators. And this second session is also going to be an incredible conversation here. I'll just go through quickly with names. This is Mabel O. Wilson. Director Kevin, Director Kevin Young, Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Chief Brad KillsCrow, Chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians. And Maria Nicanor, our director here at Cooper Hewitt. I gave a brief introduction at the beginning, but there are hundreds of people that have collaborated on the 25 installations. There's 25 individuals and collectives, and for me, it's just a dream come true to put them together to speak here with special guests on some of the core themes of the exhibition and the years of work that went into all of the projects here. One of those core themes is belonging. So what we're going to hear today is a discussion on cultivating belonging from cultural leaders, or sometimes addressing the feeling of unbelonging. Just as far as programming goes for the triennial, which we'll hear more about, this is only the beginning. We have around 2 programs per month for various different audiences. So I hope you'll follow along on the website, on our newsletter. This is just the kickoff of today, and it goes through the fall of next year. And this is an opportunity to really connect with people. So what we do is in different formats. We have lectures, we have workshops, we have curator-led tours, etc. Some of the activities for the Triennial are here at the museum, and we're also activating other sites across the city, and we're coming to DC. We have a program at Namak in July of next year. So on that note, a lot of people are involved, so I'm just going to say a few thank yous. It takes a whole host of people to make these things happen. Our education department, AV department, Alexa Cummins, Seamus, Kosa, Kim, and so many people on staff here, but we also receive a lot of support from various foundations and organizations, including Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, American Women's History Museum, National Museum of the American Latino and Asian Pacific American Center, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Lily Ann Schindlos Foundation, ReArc Institute, and many, many others. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mabel. Thank you so much, and let's kick this off. Welcome home.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. This is our second panel. The first panel was phenomenal, and really, really explored in depth a lot about the curatorial process, what it means to actually be in this space. And so I think we'll go a little bit through that, but we'll also try to talk more expansively. But I want to give a deep, 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 deep shout out to our curators, who I believe are in the audience. And if I can ask you to stand up, please do, because I think everybody needs to know who you are. Christina De Leon, Michelle Joan Wilkinson, and Alexandra is not here. Oh. But these are the people who and their teams who've brought a really, really, really amazing. We were talking. I think this is the best exhibition that's been here, particularly in the way in which it has utilized the space. And so, Maria, can you really share a little bit about, I think, the kind of histories of the triennials, but also this particular one and why it's special and important?
Yeah.
And groundbreaking.
Thank you. Yes. So some of you were here for the previous panel. So sorry for a little bit of the repetition, but it's important context as well to understand, the evolution of these triennials and how they have come to be. And we have. I'm a relatively new director here as well, so there's that lens into the story. I've been here 2 years, but have been visiting the triennials for many years. They were first started in the year 2000, and they were started as an initiative to really take pause and stop for a moment and take stock and reflect a little bit of what are the most important themes that are happening around the world, around the nation. So sort of like a bit of a collective conscience of like, what are the topics of importance right now that we should stop and talk about from the National Museum of Design. That was really the impetus for having them happen and what has pushed them forward over the years. So this one is the 7th iteration of those triennials. Typically, the themes of the triennials have been very expansive, so very typically words, not only words, but single words. There's colleagues here who have curated past versions of those triennials as well, in addition to Michelle and to Christina and to Alexandra. But there were topics recently under, like nature, beauty, again, really expansive topics that then the museum and the curators try to analyze through the lens of design. So this one, follows that lineage in a way. Many of the previous triennials were very outward looking, I would say, at least the way that I experienced them, that I know they were planned. They were looking globally as these in an attempt to create a bit of a survey of like what's happening in a field. And of course we look at design, but design is so expansive, so this also has to do with what one thinks design is. Design is so many things and sort of is an umbrella that covers many, many fields. So each triennial has also defined the fields differently, but many of them looked outside and were, I would say, international or even global in nature. This triennial is a little different in that way, and for those of you who were here for the previous version, you heard a little bit the origin story of how the curators started to think about the topic. And just like the other ones were outward looking, this one sort of like looks back inside and takes a moment of reflection as well. They did start planning this triennial, the curatorial trio, before the pandemic, but they were really struck by the height of the pandemic in the middle of it, which I know had an effect in their thinking and their planning and the way that they addressed the topic. But they had been talking about the idea of home and making home before the triennial happened, and then found themselves planning this triennial about home with a completely different meaning and a very personal point of view on that. But they really decided to look at what was happening in the country and what throughout the whole entire nation was this question of like what we call our own homes, not just personally, but also as a country, as a physical space, but also as an emotional space, which is why we've been talking a lot about the idea of belonging. So yes, home is a physical space that we inhabit, but it's also an emotional state of mind. So there was also that. So there's some differences in the topics and how curators approach them. And then the fact that this one, for example, has tackled new installations is also rather new, that differentiates itself from previous versions as well. All the works that are upstairs are new commissioned works that were made especially for this exhibition, which I think was a very generous act of the curators. We are the National Museum of Design. We are this platform that is here for others to use and to inhabit. And I think there's a certain act of generosity with the curators when they actually gave the platform away to others to make the space their own, but also to commission new work, also to pass on the funds, quite frankly, pass on that money to the creators so that they could create new work, which was something that came up in conversation yesterday during the opening. I met a lot of the families of some of the participants who were here, and specifically one of the father of one of the architects said, this has made my daughter want to continue move forward with her work. So I think there's an intent there in the creation of new work that has also been sort of like a signature of this particular one. It's been in the making for 5 to 7 years since they all started working on this. So when you go upstairs, recognize sort of like the layers and layers of information that are there. But that's the history of the triennials at the museum. Museum, and of course, we exist in a vast landscape of them. And but this one I like to think is different and unique in that we are a national platform. We are funded by the government. We'll get into that in a little bit, and we're hopeful that all of you understand that the National Collection and the National Museum, at least the way that I understand a national collection and museum to be, or a national institution of any sort, is something that belongs to everybody. I often joke, but I don't joke. One day we will do it, and I'm looking at my colleagues here in the first row. I'd love to have some sort of sign over the museum that says all of this belongs to you. It literally belongs to you. It's paid by taxpayer money, partly, and we need to use it and treat it as such because it is the collection and a space for the whole entire nation.
No, thank you for that amazing sort of overview of the triennial and sort of what sets this one apart. I mean, for me, I've been to many exhibitions. I've actually worked on exhibitions for this.
You've been featured in
and
a
I've
triennial
actually been
yourself.
in a triennial myself as an architect. But what I like about and appreciate, and I think is pretty radical, is that typically you say, oh, hey, I'm going to go see this exhibition. But what I felt when I was walking through the rooms, there's a different kind of ethos about dwelling with the work. It invites you to sit with the work, to think about it, to complicate it, and as you suggest, I mean, this is a public institution. You're inviting publics in. And so I just wanted to begin from each of your perspectives is to think about your institutional histories, your organizations, your groups. The Smithsonian has a very long history, mid-19th century institution. Its project was, I've got a whole chapter in my upcoming book on this, but was literally to increase and diffuse knowledge among men, right? So it was both research, but it was also the distribution of that research to a public. That was its project. However, it was publicly funded. It has active collecting, public exhibitions, but didn't always include everyone that, let's say, dwelled in the space of the nation, African Americans, Native Americans, and others who were just literally rendered illegible or marginal, right, to these stories. But, I think after decades, that's changed. There have been hard-fought battles. Institutions evolve, which is really, really exciting. And so, that is something to think about. Also, there's a beautiful piece when you come in by the Lenape Center in Joe Baker that really welcomes you. And it's to acknowledge that this Carnegie Mansion is sitting on the land of the Lenape and to recognize both the history of displacement, but also drawing on rich cultural practices of the Lenape peoples. And so what I would love to know from each of your perspectives in your different institutions as leaders, how do you envision the public you engage with? And how do you encourage people to participate fully in the cultural life of your community or their communities, which could be plural? And I think there's an invitation I feel upstairs. And I think all of the work that you all do is sort of a part of that. Come in, whatever's next. So could you share? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So let's see, lots of layers to your question there. I like to think that we're in this business of longevity, right, in these institutions, and we are a speck of dust in the history of the origins of these institutions and where they're supposed to go, but we have them and we hold them for a temporary amount of time. It's a short amount of time, but in that amount of time, we have the opportunity to shift these institutions, as you suggested, push certain buttons and move them forward. So at least the way that I approach a public platform like this one is in my ability of change within the DNA that exists in the institution at the same time. And that change is slow, and I think good change typically is slow, and change that happens very quickly and superficially never sticks. we do that in a variety of ways, I would say, but one of the ways in which we try to shift also the institutional histories and even the collections that we inherited. Cooper Hewitt, for example, comes from a collection that was very rooted in the decorative arts. So that was the origin of the collection as well. When the Hewitt sisters started the collection, it was very much through the lens of decorative arts in a very Eurocentric context as well, and that is the origin and the root of the collection, right? We can take that and keep it like that, or we could start to shift it and we can start to mold it and push it into different directions. So we have different tools to do that. One of the tools that I use alongside my colleagues is also acquisitions, new ways that we try to define who we are, right? What design was when they started this collection is not what design is today. So I think there's a certain effort to not just push it forward and show that we are collecting different things, different ideas, and looking at different ways of thinking, but we're also confronting and not ignoring that past as well. So we invite, like you'll see upstairs, I think it's very evident upstairs, how we invite others into the space so they can make it their own, I think is another tactic. But I think there's great work to be done also in the building and the shifting of the collections as well, because I think that's how we can show that we're changing the definition of what the institution is. So those are just a couple of ways that I think of how we think about that, and then we just are trying to break down also these barriers of what design means and inviting different groups that haven't been part of the conversation in a long time. So I think even this whole series of public programs has invited very different disciplines that we typically don't even play with at the museum. So I think we become better at playing with others. We become better at breaking disciplinary barriers. We become better at bringing out the collections that have been problematic and inviting others to reinterpret them. So and that's a very external sort of like answer to what we do with our audiences, but there's a lot of internal work that happens as well in terms of the governance of these institutions, because that external work doesn't happen if you don't address the structures of the institution internally. So I think there's a lot of work and acknowledgement that happens at the board level, at the level of the staff, in terms of how we're changing the ways that we work as well. So it's not just what you do, but how you're doing it, I think is sort of like a day by day, hour by hour effort that we do. So I think we have a variety of tools at our disposal, and those are just a few of the ones that I think of using sometimes.
Thank you. Wow, that's pretty tough to follow up. But do you mind repeating the question so I make sure, because there was so much I was trying to listen there, and so I just want to make sure that I answer what you're asking.
I mean, I think you're a leader of a community and organization, and I was just curious, how do you reach your publics? And also particularly because we're talking specifically about artistic and creative and cultural work. How do you see that as valuable to the communities through which you serve? So what is the role of culture or cultural life, and how do you draw publics into that?
Absolutely. So the Delaware Tribe of Indians, unfortunately, many of you, I'm not sure if many of you was here last night able to participate in what happened, but history hasn't been kind to the Lenape. These are our original homelands. These are our ancestors have been here for thousands and thousands of years, and these lands now, which many of you inhabit these lands. So our community back home is in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. That's where our headquarters is. And so we do have a diverse community. Not only do we have our headquarters there in Bartlesville, but we're also all throughout the United States. We're all the way from East Coast, West Coast, Canada, all the way down to Texas and whatnot. So how do we engage with our community? How do we talk to our community? Is through the way of our elders have taught us. As being a leader, being a young leader, being able to stand up and look my elders in the eyes and talk to them truthfully and tell them, what direction we're going, what direction we're headed, what's in new for us, and what are we leaving behind. And, after a lot of our forced removals, we've left a lot of things behind. Unfortunately, here in New York, there's a lot of medicines, a lot of vegetables, plants, and things that we no longer have access to due to the fact that we're in Oklahoma. And so, Thankfully, we have the Lenape Center, and I see we have an elder, one of my elders sitting in the crowd today. But he took it upon himself to go up to upper state New York and establish a farm on our behalf to grow beans and corns and squash. The three sisters that we talk about. But the ways that we communicate is through communication, through talk, through conversations, through ceremonies. We see each other not often as we'd like to, but when we do see each other, it's very powerful because we have a lot to say to one another, and we have a lot to talk about with one another. And so, I try to bring that back into my community as much as possible. Have open dialogue with all of my members. The biggest thing about being a leader for me is, especially a young leader, is having the ability to listen. And my predecessor, who passed away, he told me two things: you got to have thick skin and big ears. And no doubt that I have the big ears, but the thick skin part, that was the one that really that I had to sit down and address full speed ahead. But like I said, communicating, talking with our elders, and listening. I think listening is probably the biggest form of communication rather than talking. Listening, you get so much more just hearing somebody visit.
Thanks so much for having us and for this great conversation. I love what you said about listening. Well, thick skin and big ears probably are useful for a Smithsonian director as well. But you can also tell in the show how much I feel like the curators listened because I feel there's a lot of talk between the rooms and within the rooms. To me, it's a great example of if you build it, they will come, and the ways that thinking about my own museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I think is our own museum in the biggest sense, that's a place that we had to build, and people said it wouldn't ever get made. People said it would never get filled with stuff, and all I do all day is look for places to put things. But the thing I think about that is that first collection that came to the museum was 70% donated. And so I think about the stuff that people kept in their homes safe. And thinking about home here, that was one way of making home, is they said this, I believe, is important. And even just seeing some of the artifacts upstairs, they're ways of preserving, but also now showing in a different way. It isn't just having a run of ebony magazines, it's like this is how we experience them. And sort of representing that, I think, is so lovely because it gets at the dailiness of this work, which I think is so important, and the ways that we all have these things we're carrying and that we are responsible for preserving and keeping. And I love seeing the ways that this happens here. A couple things about Publix that you mentioned. For a poet, I like numbers, so perhaps surprisingly, but I think 40% of our original visitors had never been to any museum ever. And I think that's really important because that isn't the fault of them, it's the fault of museums. And museums have to do that work of reaching out and providing people both mirrors and also spyglasses into other realms. And I think that kind of quality is still in the museum. What surprises me is still we have 80% of people who come to our museum have never been to the museum before. I like to say the other 20% have been 10 times. So, and to me, having this kind of connection here, I see it already, the ways that you're going to be learning a lot about just who is interested in design. And of course, we know that design is something, while it might be excluded from museums, Black folks and Native people have been doing for centuries. So how do we kind of capture that sense of design in the big sense that you're mentioning? And I think that the show captures so wonderfully. I think about Du Bois's wonderful Paris Exposition renderings that you see that now are like bestsellers essentially for design books, and they were always there. And how do we kind of recapture that and give a sense of that? And I love how the museum's doing that right now, and I look forward to sort of thinking more about this idea of belonging and how we can talk about and take it apart a little bit.
And if I can just quickly add to that too, I think a lot of what museums have done over the centuries is to become gatekeepers. So we're fighting this idea of the gatekeeping, which requires a great deal of vulnerability in turning the platform over to others. So I think what's happened upstairs is exactly that. It's a platform turned over to others, to our audiences, to our communities, which are the same in some cases, and there's overlap there. And our institutions differ in that I carry the baggage of a collection in existence while you didn't have one. So therefore, like, we're trying to reshape and push what the baggage was. You're trying to create anew from things that were not anew but have to come from different places. But I think it comes down to, like, literally, and I say this as we sit on a mansion on Fifth Avenue that is gated with iron gates, is bringing those gates down in ways that requires us to be quite humble, quite honestly. I'm not the gatekeeper of this space. You're not the gatekeeper of that space. We shouldn't be, neither are you. It's all about passing it on and letting others take over. You know, I think that's to your point of the listening as well. So,
Absolutely. If I may too, we find ourselves now in a point in history where museums are actually letting us tell our story. Beforehand, they were talking for us, about us, and wanting, putting information out there that they wanted the public to hear. But nowadays, I see a change in museums, and I see a change allowing us a space and allowing us to be there to tell our story from our perspective. And I think that's very important, a note that I just kind of wanted to bring up.
Well, and I love how you put that, because it's not that black folks weren't in museums. Unfortunately, they're artifacts, they're things they created, they're aspects of design, you could say, were there. It's just they were thought of as sort of anthropological, or they were thought of as sort of sometimes an accident. They don't know how great this stuff is, but we do. And so we're showing it to you. And so I think that kind of connectivity, the circle that I think we're trying to draw, is really important.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, what I always thought was remarkable about the establishment of the African American Museum was that Lonnie Bunch and team didn't have to just build a museum, they had to build a collection, right? Because that's what I meant at the beginning. There was a sense, well, black people don't have history and culture worth collecting. On the other hand, I think the early project of the Smithsonian basically vacuumed up everything from indigenous people as the boundaries of the United States crept westward. So they had this capacious collection of Native American artifacts that, with the establishment of the museum, many were repatriated and returned, right? So museums are never neutral. They're very complicated in terms of the power. But I want to maybe get to something more intimate in how stories are being told in the exhibition. And I wanted to start with, I was listening, I like to listen to Terry Gross in Fresh Air from time to time, and she had this amazing Palestinian poet and refugee, Masab Abu Toha. And he had lost everything in the recent war. He lost all his possessions, things that he hoped to pass on. He lost his home. He wanted to pass on things to his children. And he said in the interview with Terry, quote, "I'm houseless but not homeless. I have a home to return to." And so with that in mind, and maybe thinking about some of the works in the exhibition or other things that are kind of telling the stories, can you reflect upon how we can imagine belonging in spaces, perhaps beyond a physical space, and sometimes maybe beyond our own community, so that our understanding of belonging is shared across boundaries?
I'll jump in. I studied with a poet named Seamus Heaney, and one of the things he thought about was this idea of home and poetry as a kind of homeland. And I think in some ways, art, design, these are places where people kind of reside their homes, or they place their beliefs and faith, if you will. And I'm always struck by that, not accidentally. Perhaps my first book is called Most Way Home of poetry. And in it, I was really trying to think about the ways that I think I say in that book, which I wrote so long ago but I can remember this line, but home for us is wherever we're not, which I think for African Americans maybe resonates true as well in terms of an experience of exile and an experience of displacement. But within that, finding the music. You know, the blues to me is a music of exile, but it's not a music, and it's a music that says, I'm sadder than you are. I'm sadder than anyone else, but somehow we're gonna laugh about it together. And that sort of what Ralph Ellison calls fingering the jagged grain, I think is really important. How do you talk about that? How do you worry it into pleasure? How do you worry it into movement? So to me, it's not that question of displacement, though that's there. And I think Mo Saab's a terrific poet. He's been in the New Yorker where I'm the poetry editor. But I also think it's how do you turn this tragedy or experience or the exile or your life, the things of your life, into poetry, into art. And to see, say, all those tobacco leaves in that room is just incredible to me. Like, how do you, that's one way you do it, is you don't, like, the thing the blues did is instead of saying that didn't exist, you said, I'm gonna look it straight in the eye. I'm gonna talk about the flood and looking down on the home I used to know, as Bessie Smith sings, but somehow make it into art and movement.
You know, in my community, you know, you're asking about the sense of home. I am home. I am on my ancestral homelands, and I feel that. It's a spiritual home for me. I've never physically lived here on these lands, but every time I come back, it's a sense of spirituality to me because I can feel my ancestors with me here. A lot of them are buried here, and I'll share a story with you. You know, as a young boy, you know, we didn't have the opportunity. I lived in Oklahoma. We didn't have the opportunity to come back to our homelands, but we had a lot of stories. You know, we have a lot of stories within our tribe that talk about these giant trees, that talk about these giant hills. They even talk about these gray squirrels. You know, as a little boy sitting in Oklahoma, if any of y'all been to Oklahoma, it's about as flat as this stage. There's nothing there. There's no giant trees. There's no giant hills. There's no gray squirrels. So as a boy, when you hear these stories, you're just kind of like, you know, this doesn't make no sense. I can't put two and two together, and whatnot. But we continue to listen to those, and they continue to talk about these. And then I had the opportunity about 2.5 years ago, the first time I had the opportunity to come to the homelands, the Delaware Water Gap is one of our original homelands as well. And that time, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. We took a tour with the Park Service there, and they took us through the Water Gap. But I've never in my life had a sense of belonging, had a sense of I was home, sense of this is where my ancestors, this is where I belong. And it was a spiritual and it was an emotional feeling for me. I mean, I'm a big guy, but I'm the chief of my tribe, but I had to turn away, walk away, and shed tears of proud, shed tears of my ancestors, and shed tears of just being home. So in that same sense, you know, when we do come back, you know, we don't have a space here, but when we do come back, you know, I'm a tourist in my homelands, and that hurts a little bit. That makes it even more a little difficult when we bring some of our tribal members back to experience what I experienced. To be tourists, you know, in our homelands is very difficult, and it's very difficult to. But every one of those tribal members that we bring up here, every one of them that come back, I make a point to talk to them. What was your experience like, you know, coming back to the homelands? And every one of them can tell you the exact same thing I said. It's a spiritual. It's that they never had a sense of belonging in their life. They can't put a finger on it. They can't tell you who, what, when, where, why. But all the stories, you see these giant trees, you see these gray squirrels, you see these acorns, you see all these leaves, these things that just make sense that we use on our regalia. It just blew my mind. It all made sense. As a grown man, it all just came to me. You know, listening to these stories, I was like, wow, that was very, very important. And that was the first time that I could go back and talk to my mom and tell her I was home.
Let me take it. One of the things you said connects very directly, I think, with a couple of projects that are up in the exhibition. So I might illustrate it with some of the examples that are upstairs, because you referenced physical belonging and emotional belonging? Is it rooted in a place? Is it rooted in an emotion and this sense that you can be houseless, but you're never homeless? And you'll see, again, through the exhibition, there's different themes throughout the different floors of the museum. And the second floor of the museum probably confronts some of the very difficult stories in terms of like that sense of belonging and physicality. There's two projects, one which addresses the Smithsonian directly as the home of the collection of objects, specifically of a Puerto Rican collection of objects that is kept at the Smithsonian. And then there's another project on the second floor that talks about the destruction of home. Maybe I want to zoom in into that one a little bit, because it talks about the physicality of your home disappearing and what happens when the physicality of your home disappears, but you obviously still have the sense of belonging. So there's a project upstairs by Mona Shalabi, who I think was here this morning. Are you here, Mona? No? Okay. She was here this morning. Mona Shalabi, who she is a data visualization artist, Pulitzer Prize winner, a writer as well, whose work you have definitely seen in the New York Times and other publications. And she partnered with a group of architects called C2 Studio, who are based here in Brooklyn, to help bring some of her ideas to life as well. And they wanted to talk about this idea of what happens when you do lose the physicality of your home. So they took on this difficult topic, and that we wanted to make sure to showcase, that is tackling the idea of domicide. So domicide is a term that the United Nations uses for the destruction of home during military conflict. It's a project that Christina stewarded along tirelessly for a long time to make sure that it happened upstairs. And it tackles this idea. It follows three families that were in the areas of Iraq, of Syria, and in Palestine, who lost their homes because of the strikes of US military action. And what happens when you lose your home, and how you cultivate the memory and the sense of belonging once you've gone through that sense of trauma is what the project upstairs explores, visualizes, and tries to even unpack if that's even possible, in terms of like bringing to life the difficulty of killing that sense of belonging. You can't kill that sense of belonging, even if the materiality of it is gone, right? So I think those are the perhaps unusual areas, but areas that I'm very proud to say that the show has tackled, because we can't just talk about the creation of home. We have to talk about the way that homes are reshaped, and then the way that homes are destroyed in many occasions. So I think there's a couple of the projects in the show that you'll see tackle those ideas as well, from that perspective of the loss and how you do to reconstruct after difficult circumstances like that.
Yeah, I thought that was a very powerful project, and what I appreciate about almost all of the projects are very collaborative and collective. So it's not one name, but multiple names, right? And you can sense that in how the work comes together in dialogue, actually. And that's what I mean. You kind of have to sit with these projects for a while and listen and absorb and watch and hear and also smell. And that question of belonging, the Curry Hackett work with the tobacco. He told me about that. He's a friend of mine. He told me about that piece, and the first thing I said, it's probably going to really smell very interesting, right? The sense of, and it really was. And also, what I didn't account to have that much on the wall. Also, the sense of sound was also radically shifted, and so. There was a sensorial transformation of that space, but also I'm from a family who came out of North Carolina and tobacco country, so it also connected with sort of family histories. And I was curious, how do we think about belonging as a very capacious category that can be very personal, familial, communal, national? Is there a planetary sense of belonging, for instance? Is belonging a capacious category? And if so, in what ways might works upstairs actually engage that?
You're asking planetary questions now. I like it. I like it.
But it's
we're going
true.
cosmic.
I always say
let's do it.
We're humans together here with a lot of other things.
Right.
Yeah. And this is where we belong, right, on this planet, so far as I know.
We just had an Afrofuturism show, so we're
exactly.
We have some argument. Some would say we're just here for a bit before we go back on the mothership, right? I guess I think, without getting too esoteric, I think that capaciousness, I love that idea. And I have to say, just, if you had to describe, we'll have some rooms in a mansion that will be transformed. They might feel small, but what I think you're describing is there's a room that entirely rocks. What is going on? There's spaces that feel like they have these outlooks, and that the room is like just part of getting to some other space beyond it. I think a little bit about the period room as an idea, and what that means in museums and how those have sort of, in some ways, been calcified and kind of, felt sometimes out of time. And then you had something like the Afrofuturism room in the Met, which my deputy director happened to work on, Michelle Commander. And that room, I think, is so transformative because it's thinking about imagined spaces, imagined past, what would have been had Central Park not erased, these black communities like Seneca Village. This kind of restoration, I think, is part of the project, it feels like to me, upstairs, and the ways that it's taking things that, a sense of belonging and saying, well, even if it's just this portal into some other universe, here it is. And they have that kind of Narnia feel, like, this is a wardrobe that's opening into somewhere else. And sometimes it's the past for me, sometimes it's a place that I feels familiar, and sometimes in its strangeness, it is familiar again. And so maybe that sounds a little woo-woo, but for me, that's really an important part of the process, and that's something that art can do. I always think about the ways poetry is a form of transport, and that lyrical feeling that I get from a poem, that you're someone else for the moment of the poem, and hopefully a few beats after. I also find in the museum, and a good museum to me has the objects that take you out of yourself, and suddenly you see yourself in these objects, or you connect to Harriet Tubman's shawl, or you experience suddenly this space in ways that are both sonically and maybe all your senses alerted. And I think that's another kind of belonging and transformation.
Belonging for me is I was born Lenape. I was born into a tribe. I was born with a strong sense of community. So I know my community back home is a sense of a family. I belong to something that's bigger than me. I belong, to something that wants to help one another, wants to uplift one another. We look out for each other. These days we don't hunt, but back in our days, we would go out and hunt. We'd kill a deer. It wouldn't be just for the family; it'd be for the entire community. And we still do that today. We try to disperse all that to our community in different programs that we provide for our members. But belonging, for me is I belong to a tribe. I belong to a community that supports me, uplifts me on my times down or times up. They're there for me. We may not have casinos, we may not have all the bells and whistles, but I know that I can turn to my community, and they're there for me. So for me as a chief, I'm there for my people. I'm there for them when their ups, their downs, whatever it is that we can figure out to get us on a better path. That's the sense of belonging for the Lenape.
I'm trying to dwell on your word that you use, capaciousness, which I don't have a translation for in my language, which is Spanish. But the way that I understand it as well is sort of like in an expansive way, like how much can it fit? How much can it hold? And it seems to me like a lot of what's happening upstairs, but also a lot of what has to do with this idea of belonging is very personal. If we all asked all of you right now to be a participant in this triennial, and I asked you what would you want to put in one of these rooms upstairs that spoke to you and to your idea of home, I suspect, or at least my reaction, is first very personal, very, very emotional, very connected to my personal life about what I want to talk about. That's sort of human nature, I think, if we're talking about this global sense. We first want to talk about ourselves. and that sense of belonging. But I think what's successful in the stories upstairs is that even though they start from very personal seeds, the capaciousness in the pieces upstairs is that they're all incredibly universal in the topic that they're tackling. So yes, they start from a person, they start from a memory, they start from just an image in the minds of these artists and creators, and then they've been handheld by the curators, by so many others to like formalize them into a shape also, but into a more universal idea that hopefully you'll find yourselves in. And I think that's where there's capaciousness in the pieces as well. And when you see that it's a successful exercise as well, is that you can see yourself reflected to Kevin's point, right? So, and if we extrapolate that term to what's going on in the world as well, that in a way, it's a way of thinking about generosity as well, at a planetary sense, if you want to take it there, in terms of like what we all do as individuals, but how that translates universally to something else. So I think that what works really well upstairs is that yes, they're highly specific stories of highly specific communities, but they have this expansiveness and this ability to like grow into a larger idea that you will recognize. And you will undoubtedly recognize many of the ideas upstairs as ones that elicit ideas of belonging or not belonging, of rejection or not rejection, of institutions feeling welcoming or not feeling welcoming. Like they're all very accessible in that way, and I think that's what I see as a successful kind of exercise, is when you can really see yourself recognized, even if you haven't had that kind of experience before yourself.
I mean, having worked on the show for a while, I mean, is there a particular piece that just speaks to your own sensibilities, or a work that you're drawn to, that you feel, I see myself in this work, or I see, certain aspects of how I think about belonging and also home? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I know you know the work well.
There's a few pieces that do that for me. I have to say that on the first floor, the rocking living room is one that I think about a lot. This is a piece by Devon Tynes that has been done in collaboration with an architect, with Hugh Hayes as well. And for those of you who didn't listen, the much more articulate description of the project by Alexandra earlier on, it's a piece that describes almost like the itinerant life of a singer, of a baritone singer, a very well-known one, who is on the road for many days throughout the year. And his interpretation of home is this idea of like, I go back to this space, this living room that has been recreated upstairs. But even when he does return to that space, it feels shaky. It's still moving. It's still not quite the solid grounds that he finds. But what I find, it resonates with me because he's talking about having two worlds in a way. Many of us have two or even more worlds. And I think a lot about how I straddle between my two worlds and the things from one world that I bring to the other and the others that I bring back into the other. And quite literally, quite physically. I grew up in Spain. I'm Spanish. My mother's Spanish. My father grew up in Cuba. We grew up with a lot of cultural Cuban references in the home, but then I moved to the United States, and I've been here for over 25 years. I go back and forth between these two groups of people, two different countries, two different stories, that sometimes are even 3 or 4 different groups of stories. So that piece evokes that to me, sort of like the being away and the returning and never finding that sense of belonging in either of the worlds, or still finding that instability, right? So it's powerful because it's visualized in a way where you actually see the instability, you feel the instability. Like you'll be up on that platform. I'm not suggesting that you do it. We're not allowed to get on it. But during the performances, you see the platform shaking and moving. And again, it connects with you at an emotional level, but then it triggers different things that might not have been the intent of that piece, but they make you feel and elicit other things that might connect to your personal experience, right? So there's a few pieces that do that for me upstairs, and what I hope is that everybody can find one of those ways. And even just walking through the show in the, less than one day that it's been open, it's made people open up with their own personal stories. So it's almost, I don't have to, usually I'm very used to the curators to doing tours for exhibitions, and we sit there, we explain, people take it in, they listen. These tours are very different because suddenly people want to tell you their stories, right? And everything sort of like pours out. So in a way, they're excuses for conversations that become very, very personal, and I think all of the pieces, frankly, do that. Yeah.
If I may, I enjoyed you bringing up the fact that living in two different worlds. As a Lenape person, we do live in two different worlds. We have to live in our cultural, our community, where we speak our language and where we have our ceremonies, and then we have to take that hat off and turn around and pay taxes, do those things that the colonizers have done for us for many years. I think my first experience of living in two different worlds when I was just a young boy, believe it or not, I had braids. I had long hair that, came down here, and my mom, braided my hair every day to school. But every day I went to school, the non-Indian kids made fun of me. They called me a girl, they called me this and that, and I didn't understand that because the majority of our native kids, had long hair. That was the first time that I understood that I'm living in two different worlds. And it's hard to adapt to that. It's hard to understand that, but we do. We do live in two different worlds, and it's something that I think everybody in this room lives in two different worlds, and it's how you adapt to it and how you it comes to you. What you do with it, how you make it. So I just wanted to just iterate that.
Anything you want to add?
I can't follow those beautiful.
Okay, and so I have one more, sort of maybe a last question. The reason I think this is such an amazing show, Making Home, is it's the first time I've really seen it, a show here really engage the fact that this is a mansion. It's a home, but it's a mansion, and it really draws out the fact that this was a home for someone, and has a complicated history. And it transforms. It's been an institution, but it kind of gets back to the kind of origins of this as a building, right? And I love the term poesis because it is to make, right? And poetry takes language and radically transforms it and opens it up, transmutes up, so that it opens it to other worlds, right? So making is a poetic act to begin with. And also the works upstairs are really amazing in terms of the craft and how they're made. There's so much found objects, or the felt in that room in the corner is just the care that went into that. And so what I wanted to ask each of you is, can you name a thing or a space or a ritual in your home that threads together the present with your past and how you imagine the future? Or so you could say, memory and utopia.
Easy questions, Mabel. You really have.
Well, I will give you a minute to think about that. The Curry Hackett piece, actually, because there was this collection of cast iron. And I'm having a party for a friend's 60th birthday, and I made cornbread, and I was looking for my mom's cornbread recipe in a collection of recipes that she had. And I don't know, there was something about going back into that and thinking about childhood and my mom and my father's family who ran restaurants. And I don't know, there was just something important about that. And then the ritual of just making cornbread, for someone else. You said generosity. I don't know, there are things in our home that are so meaningful and that reach into a kind of interior space, but also reach beyond. And I was curious if there are things in your own homes that have that.
I have many, many things that that have either come from my past or I've sought out that, to me, speak to these things. I love seeing, for instance, Renee's piece upstairs, which may be flashing soon, where she has this little tiny room that I understand used to be the powder room and has those old photographs on the wall, though she's sort of, they're doing different hairstyles than maybe the original. And I have a ton of those and used to sort of think of that when I was traveling. I would go into antique stores and I would rescue them, it felt like. these lost family members. And at first it was in many ways because I didn't have that from my family. You know, I felt like that wasn't there. I later, especially when my grandparents died, inherited some of that stuff, so that's been really special. But those sort of imagined ancestors were just as important for me, and there were ways of kind of capturing them. And I remember going into one place in Pennsylvania, and there were these two little boys in one of those, you know, like octagonal shaped glass portraits, and it was such a great portrait. And I was like, well, you know, whose family is that? He was like, I bought that from, like, the kids of those people, and they just wanted to get rid of it. And he was like, I tried to, I begged them to keep it, and I was like, well, you know, now you're begging me to buy it, you know, and just to have those two little kids who had grown up and had families who somehow didn't see those as valuable. And I, you know, this is before there was a museum, and I wonder if they would think of them slightly different now. One of the things we do is think about community curation, and, you know, while the museum was being built, helping people understand how to take care of that. It isn't that everything can be in the museum, but that, I think, like poetry, how do you recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary? How do you keep that safe? And to me, there's always someone in the family who does that, in Black families especially. Unfortunately, that's me, because it takes a lot of room. But I'll speak to one other object, which is that I have my grandfather's fiddle. He played Zydeco music. And so I have a couple, when he died, I got some of the photos, one of him in the 20s holding up this fiddle. So it's incredible to have, but what's interesting is my dad had it. I got it from my dad when he died, and he had just, like, thrown it in the garage. And I knew he treasured it, but I said, why do you put it in the garage? And he said, because it's not how I remember it. It's beat up. He tried to do things late in life. It isn't that same as it was in the picture. You can't play it necessarily. And I think that's a really interesting complication of my desire to keep things, and you know, I don't mind if they're old. And for him, he didn't like that. He wanted it to be restored. He wanted to have that memory in a way restored. And I think there's always that tension, I think, about retaining knowledge, but also, do you burnish it? How do you keep it? And we do that in the museum a lot. You know, we restored Chuck Berry's Cadillac, and I think, you know, you have to. It looks gorgeous. But it's also symbolic because it's the car that he drove on stage in the Fox Theater, which he was denied, you know, being able to go to, much less play at, because he was Black. And so when he triumphantly returns, he pulls this Cadillac on stage, and it's about as long as this room. And, you know, like, that's what it means. It isn't just beautiful because it's a beautiful design. It's also beautiful because it was his and because he used it to say something.
For me, cultural and ceremonies is what's important to me. I think that's what that's what makes who we are. Culture is a way of life. For my Lenape people, without that, we would have nothing. And, you know, for us to be able to carry these ceremonies and carry our cultural ways for thousands of years, even till today, that is very important, and that's what makes up our tribe, and that's what makes up of who we are. So it's very important that we continue that. There's a big effort in my tribe to continue that with our young ones. All the way up, you know, even to our older ones who are just coming into the tribe who have not been around. We make that available, and like I said, I think that's what, if we don't have that culture, we don't have those ceremonies, we don't have those sacred songs that we sing, you know, that's, who would we be? You know, we would have lost it all. You know, we lost a lot in a lot of our forest removals. Like I said earlier, we lost our medicinal plants. You know, they don't grow in Oklahoma, they only grow here. So, you know, we lose some things, but there's things that, as the Lenape people, that we've hung on to and we continue to do. So it's very important that we continue our culture, we hang on to that, and I believe that's what separates us from any other nation.
What your question evokes in me a little bit is also thinking of multiple generations and how you pass on those rituals, and whether you cultivate that for yourself or for others. I have two little kids, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I think all the time. Now, I did not before, and I didn't value it enough before. I think a lot of, like, what those rituals might be for them. And I've also felt a different sense as one ages, I seek those rituals more in a way, and I seek tradition more than I used to, and I probably even disengaged from it or was dismissive about it before, thinking that that was an act of rebellion. And I've changed my mind quite a bit as to what that is, and I realize that I can't quote or use one single ritual that we do at home, but it's quite a multisensorial thing that involves music and food and repairing clothes and garments from grandparents and things like that. I'm always wearing something that belongs to one of my grandparents that I fixed or reused. But what I think more is about how I recreate that for my children. And I think of that a lot and what they are going to think about their sense of belonging. One of them is born in London, grew up in Madrid, moved to New York. The other one was born in Houston, then moved to New York. Where will they be from? Where are they going to say they were from? I have no idea. So I think that in terms of like how we pass the ritual, and I miss rituals in this country, as opposed to the cultures that I grew up surrounded by. There's a great little book called The Disappearance of Ritual that a very good friend of mine recommended. It's by Boho Chul, a Korean writer. I highly recommend it, and it put into words feelings that I was having, that I was associating with aging. So it's the search for the ritual, I think is something that I seek more in a way. And have looked for it at home, and now I'm coming to my place of work and I'm finding ritual upstairs in my offices, in the galleries. And that's comforting. That's comforting, and it's giving me the tools and I think the language also to talk to my children about it in the future.
So we can open it up to Q&A, so if there are questions in the audience.
All right. First of all, I want to recognize my chief, Brad KillsCrow. I want to thank you for being here, Chief. Last night, you were also here I know it was a private event, but it was a full house. When we walked into that first space, the artist Joe Baker with Lenape Center and those beautiful turkey capes and the wallpaper with the different trees and leaves, just amazing. But that was kind of a static expression of our culture and the contribution to this exhibit in this museum. But then after food and fellowship, we went outside. We brought out the drum. We came together in a circle in that round dance. Friendship, community, and I was amazed about how many people had never been involved in anything like that. Instead of watching as passive observers, they were anxious to get out there and feel that spirit. I was wondering how you all felt about that and in the presence of that.
So when things like that happen, and when buildings with the heaviness of this building are in that presence, to me it feels, can I use the word exorcism? It feels like an exorcism of like what happened, and it feels like a way of moving forward and a way of having others be a participant of that. I was impressed, like you were, by the number of people who joined. They weren't just watching. They joined, is what we were commenting on before. So that sense of liveliness that brought is not something I've experienced before in an institutional setting, for example.
It was a very beautiful, awesome sight. I had no idea what we're going to get ourselves into. But when they started singing and we had our dancers out there, it wasn't maybe after the second song that whole tent was full, and so many people with smiles on their face. They could feel that. They could feel that that sense of spirituality, that energy. They felt that energy, and they decided to come out there regardless of their color of their skin or whatever. If they're not in beat, if they don't have any rhythm or not, they came out and they participated, and that was a beautiful sight to see. Our culture. We open it up to people, and last night when we did that, I was very honored for each and every one of those who came out and danced with us. So that was very special.
Other questions out there? Here we go.
Thank you all so much. I'm curious, and getting back to this idea of dwelling in the spaces, there's something when you're in a space that is someone's home, but you haven't quite been invited in, where you feel a little bit like a voyeur. So I'm curious a little bit how you're thinking, and you were mentioning about inviting people into museums who have never been in museums before. So sort of this discomfort, but in a space of intimacy and comfort, and sort of what you all think about that.
So I'm very interested in the models, in the model of libraries, and the way that libraries do that, and how it differs from how museums do that, and the different ways that you feel differently when you walk into a museum in an institutional setting than when you walk into a library, and you almost know what you can do, what you're allowed to do. Note the word allowed, because of the sense that you are not or have not historically been allowed to do certain things in museum spaces. So I think a lot about that, and I think a lot of the work that we're doing here, at least, is we're trying to turn that a little upside down, and it's long and slow work, but I think you need to exist in people's imaginaries as a space where you're allowed to just flow in and without asking for that level of permission. And I think that's the problem that museums have, right? There's this, do I belong here? Do I have to ask permission? Am I allowed to touch all of these sort of like imposed ideas? So I think a lot of what we're trying to do and what's happening upstairs right now as well is sort of giving up that idea of the permission. And I think one mechanism has been using a topic that all of you, everybody is an expert on, right? So if you provide that sort of like initial point of entry, hopefully it becomes a more welcoming experience in that way. But there's a lot of work to do because of the way that museums were structured historically and what they started being, again, to the idea of the gatekeeping, right? So I'm actually interested in other models of institutions as well, and how we become a little bit more hybrid to change those issues. Yeah.
I think for me, last night was a prime example for us to have that round dance. That's a social dance that we do back home. It involves men and women, and the opportunity to invite all those to come join us. And, not necessarily, hey, watch us. No, come participate, come be a part of this, and everybody did. So I think last night was a prime example of what kind of your question for me.
Yeah, it was super beautiful, and you described it so well. I think that is a great model, as our public libraries. I used to run a public library here in the city, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, going to be 100 next year. And I think of that 100 years because it's also, almost the same 100 years it took for the museum to get built. And what institutions mean over that time, and what it means to take care and caretake and steward this material. And I think that stewardship is really crucial. And I think of us as stewards in the museum of this material. Having Harriet Tubman's shawl or her hymnal isn't for us, And it's just to have that object, just to take one, which she knew every word of, but perhaps couldn't read, is really special to see the ways that we can share that material, and that as a public institution, it means something different. And I think visual art means something different in our museum. To have the Breonna Taylor portrait that Amy Sherrill painted means something different in our museum upstairs from Emmett Till's casket. So I think people make those kinds of connections on their own, but they're also connecting with the objects, but also with each other and themselves. And I believe that transformative quality of experience rather than viewing is really powerful and is really central to this idea of a public and of a community. And I think people, especially in New York, they feel ownership over their local library, over their institutions. And I hope that continues. And I think what I love about this, being able to collaborate and lend whatever we can to the show is really to see that in action and see the ways that, there are a lot of communities that are both going to come to the space but also who are represented and participate already. And so to me, they're already there, and it's sort of like, how do you raise them up? How do you get them in the door? How do you help understand? And even a place like Schaumburg, we had to help people understand this isn't a thing you have to be special to go in. Anyone, it's your Schaumburg Center. It's your museum. All those things are real. You know, building that beautiful building in DC, if no one came in it, it wouldn't matter. So how do you make sure that people know it's theirs? And you know, I think they've done a great job of helping people understand that. One of those aspects is Black design. And the last thing I'll say is, I remember, you know, we're building, you know, we have Black art on the wall. We have Black design now, thanks to Michelle and her great curating of the area that's part of the art museum. The art section also is devoted to design. And so now any school kid who comes there, and we get a lot, they know, they might not name all of them, but they know there's a Black artist, that Black artist exists, that Black design exists. I don't know if I knew that growing up. So that's a wonderful thing to plant a seed, I guess, and think about the ways it's going to grow later.
Ask the last question, I think, because I've been dying to ask Chief KillsCrow something. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Chief KillsCrow, I heard that you were a basketball player. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So I was wondering, as you know, from basketball and maybe just being a team player, what that means as far as like how that translates to being a cultural leader, and if there's like something that taught you to work with as a basketball player or as a leader or vice versa.
Absolutely. So yeah, I did play basketball, and I played basketball at college. So I enjoy the game, and I even eventually went on to coach for a little bit. So being a team player is crucial into my mission today. You know, you can't always be the point guard. You can't always be the guy dunking. Somebody has to go do the dirty work, rebounds, those type of things, take charges. And so being in leadership, you do a lot of that. You know, you do a lot of the things that nobody wants to do. But in order for us to win, for my tribe to be successful, we all have to be a team player, and we all have to come together for the betterment of the Delaware tribe.
I thought she was going to have you dunk right now or something.
We can do that. We can do that.
Now that you're here.
I thought she was picking
What'd you
her.
play? What was your position?
I was actually a three guard. I was a three-point shooter. So, yeah, believe it or not.
We believe it.
I believe it. I wouldn't take you on.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Let's
Thank
give a
you.
big round of applause.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Please go check out the show.